recognizing that what we can control is how we feel about the situation or how we view the situation. So I can't control externally necessarily what my baby's doing and how they're crying. I can't control what the people at work are thinking about me when I had to leave at 5 o'clock to go and pick up from childcare. But I do have a sense of control of how I view that. And so kind of reframing that in my own mind, actually my baby's crying and I can't manage this in terms of I can't stop the crying. That doesn't make me a bad mother. It just makes me a mother who's got a child that happens to be crying at the moment.
Right.
And when other people look at me when I leave work, that doesn't make me a bad professional. I'm just somebody that needs to leave at 5 o'clock to go and pick up. And actually, isn't that great? Because I'm setting role models for other people of I can do my work and do it amazingly well, but I can still also focus on motherhood.
Welcome to the Motherhood Clinic, a podcast about caring for mothers after childbirth, led by clinical experience and real-life stories. If you're a new mum and ever asked yourself, is what I'm going through normal? Should I be worried? Or who should I ask for help? This podcast is for you. It's for anyone navigating those early weeks, months, or even years after having a baby. Each episode brings together voices from across the motherhood journey, from clinicians, experts, and mothers from all walks of life. We're here to help you feel more empowered in your unique motherhood journey. We believe in a better start to motherhood.
Welcome back, Kirstie. Thank you for joining us on the next episode of the Motherhood Clinic. We're talking about returning well and a practical guide for mothers returning after maternity leave.
Yes.
We talked in the previous episode about 3 key areas of challenges that people face.
Yeah.
Talking about out of the loop, feeling out of the loop, managing a dual role, and addressing cultures and norms that we all have.
Yeah.
We want to focus discussion really on the practical guide and actioning things to address those problems. And I think that people will get a lot of value from this discussion and obviously the book you've written, which is called Returning Well, a guide for working parents and their managers. And we'll put the link in the description for that. So I wonder if you want to set the scene a bit, Kirstie, for this conversation and where how you think about these strategies.
Yeah. So I guess it's first of all trying to identify for yourself what are the things that we're finding challenging. And then once we've been able to do that, really think of what are different ways of tackling that. And there's either practical things we can do or there's cognitive or emotional things that we can do. So kind of thinking about that. And there'll be a chunk of things that we can do before we return to work. And then there's also a chunk of things that we can do once we've returned to work as well. So how do I set myself up for that return? And how do I, once I have returned, then think about what strategies I kind of want to implement as well? There is clearly some stuff we do before we go off and leave as well, but kind of that's just another category, probably more helpful to focus on when we're off. And then once we're back in terms of the different things that we can be doing.
Perfect. I love the clarity of each of those steps. It's really speaks. So let's talk about, you mentioned the first,
The clarity's got to be there because you're feeling overwhelmed as it is. It's kind of like if it isn't clear, it's not going to be helpful. So yeah, that's a definite philosophy of mine in terms of trying to help people. It's got to be really clearly laid out because otherwise it's just causing more confusion. Yeah.
Yes. So let's start with that first step. And you mentioned, you can be fully aware of the problems you've got, but it's identifying which ones you put, and you talked a lot about the individualization of those problems, because the problems I experience will be different to the problems you experience and to different levels of degree. My first issue might not be your first issue. So where would you advise a mother listening in? What is the process to identify her top issues and to understand, to make that explicit? Where do we start?
I guess that ability to just sit down and reflect. I mean, I hopefully with somebody else that can kind of lead us through that conversation, but otherwise that self-reflection of what am I feeling overwhelmed by? What am I feeling anxious by? What are the things that are keeping me awake at night, apart from my baby? And therefore, what are the types of things that would be useful for me to pick up on? And then thinking about, as we mentioned, these kind of different categories of areas that we could make a start on. So, for example, I talk a lot in the book and a lot when I'm coaching people about getting the practical things sorted, because actually there's a whole chunk of things that we can be doing that actually then help us feel more on top of things. So if I'm feeling overwhelmed, if I've managed to tick off a whole load of things, and there's a whole psychology about ticking things off and how that makes us feel as well, that actually I've just taken some of those things off my plate, which is helping me feel more able to cope for when I do go back into the workplace in terms of getting some of those practical things sorted.
And talk to me about, the role of a coach such as yourself in this. Now, as I said, not everyone will be able to afford a coach or need a coach, but there is a role obviously that you do play that people do find valuable. And so talk to me about the role that you play in helping people identify with that. And then also let's talk about people that may not be able to do that, and what can they still do in the absence of a coach. But let's talk about what you do
Yeah.
and the value that you bring to these conversations.
I mean, so typically when I work with people, you kind of have conversations before people go off on parental leave. And obviously there's both mothers and fathers. I mean, much more in terms of mothers, but the conversations you have before you go off, once you're off, and then when you're back in the workplace. So you kind of have coaching sessions at those 3 stages. And then typically sort of a few months after you've got back and you've then made that adjustment. And it's really helping. We talked a lot about awareness in the last one. It's really helping the individual think through what are the things they're finding challenging, to kind of raise those levels of awareness in themselves, and then helping them think through both practically and emotionally what can they be doing to solve those challenges. But as you said, lots of people can't afford coaches, that don't have organizations that support that. And that really was a driver behind why I wrote the book, because it feels like I've got all this knowledge and it seems such a shame that it goes to quite a small group of people in terms of organizations or individuals I work with. So it was really trying to uh, share all of that knowledge I have, and clearly all of the stuff that's come from the other parents as well, so that people can manage through this process if they don't have a coach as well.
Fantastic. And are there any particular questions that you would single out from in this exercise of identifying what you would do? Are there any, is there a key question that you ask people, or an area that you really dig into that help uncover what some of these priorities are for people? Or is it just an ongoing conversation that you start to tease out and work through with people?
Yeah, I think it's more that, and it's interesting in terms of asking questions. So our youngest daughter a long time ago said to me, "Oh, kind of, Mum, what's your job?" And I said, "Oh, I'm kind of a psychologist and executive coach." And she's like, "What's the coach involve?" And I said, "Oh, kind of asking questions basically." And she said, "Oh, I could ask questions. Do you get paid for that?" I'm like, "Yeah." She's like, "Oh, brilliant." I said, but the trick is knowing which question to ask. And it's not, here's a list of questions, ask these. It's really figuring out in that moment what is going to be kind of most helpful. So I mean, my original coach training was kind of 30 years ago, and I've kind of been doing it ever since. So I mean, the kind of, it's more the philosophy in terms of asking open questions, I guess, rather than this is a question. So really keeping it kind of broad and open to start with, and then sort of helping funnel it down, I would say, rather than a specific question.
I want to dig into as well the you've mentioned there's, I guess, you mentioned practical and cognitive. It's almost like the emotional and the behavioral side of thing, right? Let's dig into particular strategies that you call out in the book, or that you've recommended, that people can work through when they think about how do I address this. What would you call out there?
Yeah, so we talked a bit. So in terms of practically, kind of, I'd mentioned that was one of the key ones, and that you can split into, my child-related practicalities in terms of sorting out childcare, my domestic stuff, work-related stuff, and also kind of self. So there's a whole load of stuff kind of practically about getting that sorted. But some of those might be more obvious to people, not necessarily, but might be more obvious. I think where people don't necessarily have the tools and techniques is thinking around emotionally coping and how we manage that. And I look at that in 2 spheres. So I think about the common emotions that we experience. before we go back to work, and what are some of the strategies around that? And then also cognitive coping when we're back in the workplace and the kind of strategies around that. So would it be useful to pick up on those a bit more in terms of
Absolutely.
about that?
Please. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there's something about recognizing what our concerns are and doing a reality check on them. So I think I'd mentioned previously in terms of kind of horror stories. So there may well be things that we have that we are feeling very anxious about, but
Mm.
actually doing a reality check on those and understanding, is that really true? Or is that stuff that I have catastrophized about, which is a very common thing that we do, that we think, "Oh, I'm never going to be able to cope back in the workplace, and and actually spending some time going, well, look, actually, these are the things that I'm good at. I've coped before. I know I can cope, and kind of that being more realistic in our expectations rather
Hmm.
than the catastrophizing. There's something about, for a lot of mums, not all, but quite a few mums, there can be something about leaving our baby, and how do we emotionally prepare for that? So
Mm.
thinking about easing our guilt of suddenly I'm abandoning my baby in childcare, even if I really think the childcare is fantastic. So how do we prep for that by, doing practice runs, or thinking about, going out for an evening and leaving our child with somebody so that we emotionally prepare for that. And there's something about recognizing our own expectations of ourselves. And we talked a bit about this previously as well. We touched on this, but our shoulds and our shouldn'ts.
Mm.
So to be a good mother, I should be doing, or to be a good working professional, I should be doing. And what are those unhelpful expectations that we've set for ourselves that actually are making things harder for ourselves? And this idea of thinking about, as we'd already mentioned, would I have those expectations of somebody else? And also, would I have those expectations of my partner as well? Is often quite an interesting one.
Yeah, yeah. I think the shoulds and the musts is again, it's hard to almost to articulate until you've actually been through that. But what you're the weight you can put on yourself is unimaginable, and although it's obviously in your mind, it's so real. It really is.
Yeah,
I think, and it's hard to explain that until you've actually experienced that. But you create a bit of a prison for yourself, and but to you, you don't have any, you don't see the world any differently. And even if someone were to, again, I've been in situations where looking back, you're like, well, that was obvious that was okay. But when you're in it, you're just like, you can't see any differently.
yeah,
And I think part of what you touch upon between the behavioral and the emotional side is I can also identify, and we see a lot of mums where, and parents in general, not just, this isn't just particular to mums, where the behavioral side takes over because there's so many to-dos, right? In motherhood, and also with work, there's a sense of, there's always that list of to-dos to be done, and they're quite tangible because you, again, that sense of like, I've knocked things off my
yeah,
list and I feel good and I've done all that. So I've often, and myself included, you kind of go into behavioral overdrive because you feel a sense of achievement there. And
yeah,
what happens is the emotional side, which is under the surface, is rumbling away because you can never know if that's been dealt with or not. You just don't deal with it. And also because you don't know how to deal with it unless you've got the intentional awareness and education or the access to things. So what happens is behavioral Kirstie kind of takes over and it becomes 90% of you. And all the while, that 10% of the emotional will actually, at some point, will kind of just burst because you haven't taken the time to really address. And obviously, the emotion drives and the cognition drives the behavior unaware to you. So I think, again, what you're calling out and what I'm picking up is the need to address that balance and to recognize when you are just going into behavioral overdrive and it's just about solving all the problems that you've got and feeling like, okay, I've done that, I've done this.
yeah,
So I think that's something that I personally can kind of identify with,
yeah, yeah, yeah. So how am I recognizing the emotions that I'm feeling, and not labeling those as good or bad, but just recognizing those are the things that I'm feeling, and therefore how can I manage those in a way that's going to be helpful for me. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think particularly for, we talked about those super mums, and the identity shift that creates for them, where, there's so many of those amazing women in the workplace that have absolutely smashing it, and they're achieving new heights, and they're used to, working at a very high level. Then they come out of the workforce, for mother to have their baby, etc. And it may be the first time where they're experiencing that sometimes hard work doesn't equal output, right? Because you never know, you can never attribute sometimes the output of what happens with your baby and what they're feeling, if they're feeling good or bad, to your hard work, because it might just be that you've got, there are challenges outside of your control.
Yeah.
So that surrendering of control can be very challenging, particularly for those that have always operated, where my hard work has always, equaled a successful outcome. And sometimes, no matter how hard you work at that crying baby, they're just going to cry. And that could be a very hard shift for an identity to go through, which then shatters sometimes the work identity, because now this is the first time that haven't figure something out the way that you've used to be figuring things out.
Yeah. And actually, our baby will pick up if we're desperately sort of trying and we're stressed in terms of our practically trying. Clearly, our baby emotionally picks up on that as well, and you've set up a cycle that they picked up on our kind of angst and emotions, and in terms of their emotional self-regulation is dependent on us when babies are young, that they self-regulate based on our emotions as well. So yeah, we're potentially making things kind of worse for ourselves as well. But it is tricky. Yeah. If I've always been able to cope and manage by just putting in the kind of extra hours and working extra hard, and suddenly that's not the same when I'm having a baby. I mean, there'll be some, clearly, actually, if I'm batch cooking my meals and sticking them in the freezer and being very organized, then that's going to alleviate some of my feeling overwhelmed. But I've still potentially have to think through strategies in terms of handling emotions that are commonly felt for work.
And so what would you say to those, if you had a supermum in front of you, a supermum at work that was really finding it challenging and going through this, or just maybe blissfully unaware that they were just trying to kind of fire on all cylinders across everything? What would you say to them? Where would you start with them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I would label people super mums. I don't think that's necessarily a helpful label, because it's like, I'm not a super mum? And also,
that's a good point. Good point.
I think there's something about, actually, I may on the outside be managing really well, but I'm kind of not managing on the inside. I think it's really helpful it goes back to this thing of awareness, getting people to step back and recognize where they are.
Yeah.
And you talked quite a lot about this idea of control, and that we feel kind of out of control. And that's, for anybody in any situation, that is something that is, or has the potential to be, very hard if we feel out of control in terms of the levels of anxiety that raises in us. And so I've talked about this with you previously, haven't we, in terms of that recognizing that what we can control, and it's easier said than done, but what we can control is how we feel about the situation or how we view the situation. So I can't control externally necessarily what my baby's doing and how they're crying. I can't control what the people at work are thinking about me when I have to leave at 5 o'clock to go and pick up from childcare. But I do have a sense of control of how I view that. And so kind of reframing that in my own mind. Actually, my baby's crying and I can't manage this in terms of I can't stop the crying. That doesn't make me a bad mother. It just makes me a mother who's got a child that happens to be crying at the moment. And when other people look at me when I kind of leave work, that doesn't make me a bad professional or a bad working person. I'm just somebody that needs to leave at 5 o'clock to go and pick up. And actually, isn't that great? Because I'm setting role models for other people of, I can do my work and do it amazingly well, but I can still also focus on motherhood.
Great. And again, it's a good call out. Thank you for calling that out, because it's even as someone having this conversation, that's something I unintentionally, like, you label people, right? Or you create these labels for yourself, like the supermom or not. And again, that raises its own issues, which is, am I this or am I that? And actually, your key thing that I'm taking it is the individualization, which is you're none of those necessarily. You don't have to belong to a certain category. And there is a real impact of how you label yourself, and that's another bit of this inner dialogue that you have with yourself. You label yourself certain things. I'm this, I'm that, and other people do it to yourself unintentionally, like I've just done, right? And I think it's, again, a lot of what you talk about is just being clear, calling that out, and being aware that we may unintentionally do this to ourselves, or we do it to other people, right?
Just societally, there's a lot of stuff about good mother, bad mother. And so, kind of one of the clear pieces of research is around going back to work as a mother. And if we are going back out of financial necessity, or if we're going as a choice. So societally, I tend to be viewed as a bad mother if I've gone back because I'm choosing to go back because it's fulfilling for me and it's important for me and my identity, rather than, look, I have to go back because financially we can't afford to. I can't afford not to. So, there's a whole load of stuff in terms of how we get labelled by society as well.
Yeah. Well, that's one area I'd love to delve into. And there's two conversations I'm holding in my mind. One is that what you're alluding to, and you call it a very useful framework, those 3 Fs and those 3 Cs, but that was a very intuitive way to look at things in terms of what you're balancing. And there's another one around a lot of what you talk about in your way of working is how to work with your managers and what you can do. There's work you do for yourself, obviously, in the first instance, to kind of improve your standing, but there's also work you can do with your managers, a very practical thing. So where should we go next, Kirstie? Do we talk
So
about how to train?
you'd mentioned the 3 Fs, which I kind of know you like an acronym with your consulting background, because it can be one
Let's
that
do
we
that.
can start with. So that's finance, fulfillment, and flexibility. So finance, fulfillment, and flexibility. And it's one of the things that I often talk to people about when they're thinking about choices of how they go back to work.
Yep.
Because clearly there's lots of different ways that we can choose to go back to work depending on our kind of workplace. And although there's clearly a legal requirement in the UK that you have the right to be seriously considered for flexible working, that in practice doesn't necessarily always happen. But it's that being clear for ourselves at this point in time, what is important to me. So I had a nice example of 2 women who I was coaching and I kind of interviewed as well, who both working for a very big investment bank. And they made very different choices in terms of how they initially went back. With one saying, this level of fulfillment's really important to me, and I can't do that kind of role part-time. And I can't do that kind of role anything other than full on. And therefore I am going to have to sacrifice a level of flexibility to get that level of fulfillment that I want. Whereas another mum going back had said, at this point in my career, this wouldn't be the kind of role that I would normally take, but it does mean that I don't have to work those stupid hours because I'm not also working with the US anymore. And therefore I'm only working with Europe, and therefore this is much more manageable. And therefore I'm sacrificing some of that I'm sacrificing some of that fulfillment at this point in time in terms of my flexibility. And then clearly finances will have an impact as well as part of the kind of triangle, that I want this level of flexibility, but what does that mean in terms of the level of finance that I need, and am I able to do that? And so it's that recognizing for myself what's important in those 3 areas at this point in time, and then revisiting it as well. Because do you know what? I've been back at work for 6 months now. I really wanted to work part-time when I adjusted back in again. But actually now I'm on top of it, and therefore actually I'm quite happy to go kind of back up. Or conversely, it might be I'm working this way and I'm just thinking, my God, I'm never seeing my baby, and it's a short period of time that they're this age, and therefore I'm going to decide to take a step back and that I work so that I get more time at home. So how we match both.
No, that's great. I think that's such a helpful way to look at things, because you're saying that there's such clear impact from each of those on all the others. Like you move one area of flexibility will impact your finances, which will affect your sense of fulfillment, and they all impact each other at the same time. And then importantly, it's not one point in time discussion. It's a continual one at certain checkpoints, and not just with you, but it was also you and if you have a partner.
Absolutely,
It's
yeah.
that combined, you're all in it, because now there's three of you. It's you, your partner, and the baby, right? And maybe my three Fs might be different to your three Fs, but we have to work out between us
Definitely be different. Yeah.
what that looks like. So, but as a family unit, what's our level of flexibility we want collectively, right? And financially collectively, and fulfillment collectively, because often, as you said, there's probably some ingrained perceptions or assumptions that are made that never get spoken about, and that's obviously where problems arise, because no one ever thought that. Oh, I just assumed you'd be a stay-at-home mom, and I thought I would be the breadwinner, and that's just I'm always the high earner, so yeah, of course I'm going to carry on, and you're going to take care of this, or
That's a whole other book, Patrick, which I would have loved to, which I'd have loved to have written, but I didn't do the research. One of my INSEAD professors wrote a book called Couples That Work, and it's one that I often recommend to people that I'm working with that are kind of couples where they're dual career, and how you manage that at different points in time. And obviously having a child, if you have one, is kind of one of those crunch points. But yeah, that's another field of research that's fascinating, and a really good book on that as well.
That also is the reality, is what proportion of families now have to have two working parents compared to what it was a generation or two ago. Like the reality is, I don't know many people that don't have both working parents, to be honest. So that is just that's a challenge that most, I think, parents in this generation and going forward will probably face. So it's the new reality, or not new, but newish compared to maybe our parents or the old generations, or maybe even culturally. That's a different look at things. So yeah, I think a very helpful way to look at that. You also mentioned, do we go into the 3 C's? Is that too much frameworking? Is that a helpful conversation here now?
Yeah, that's before you go on parental leave. So it's cover, communications, and career. So thinking about your maternity cover, what comms you're going to have while you're off, and what kind of career discussions. So those are the 3 things you really need to tackle before you go off on paternity leave.
Well, I wonder if that would be a great way to move on to next, Kirstie, because that kind of goes into that last bit. You spoke right at the beginning. We talked about identity shifts, we talked about the behavioral versus emotional, practical and cognitive, and then we talked about the before and after picture. So if we kind of round out with this, what would you do before, during, and after, and delve into a bit of the strategies that you then go into in the book, and what you kind of
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We can. Yeah, I mean, as I said, those are the 3 areas that I tend to end up talking to people about. So thinking about how my work is going to be covered while I'm off, so that I'm not working up until my due date, because babies can come early as well. So really thinking about that and how my work is going to be covered, because there can be a whole sense of guilt around leaving either individuals that we're managing, or kind of leaving projects, and how we manage that. Thinking about career discussions to have before we go off. Because if we're out for a chunk of time, are we going to be missing out? Also, we should still be assessed in the same way. If we're in an organisation that has performance reviews, we should be assessed in the same way. But for our 6 months, we're there as part of that performance year, not against people that have been working the full year. So there's lots of discussions around that. And then also thinking about the communications we want when we're off, and how we're gonna manage those. So those are 3 big areas. I think probably one of the biggest areas that we haven't touched on, we talked quite a bit about prepping before we go back. Probably one of the biggest areas we've not picked on is when we return. There's a couple of things. There's something about kind of rationalizing the decisions that we make, but also something about creating priorities and boundaries for ourselves. And that's really important. It's also something I end up talking to people lots about with working from home, and thinking about how we manage that, because that's set up a whole different can of worms in terms of how we manage any division between work and home life when we're working from home. I'm really thinking about that, which can really help alleviate feelings of guilt, because I've already decided what are my boundaries and priorities, and therefore I'm less likely to feel either guilty at work because I'm not with my baby, or guilty when I'm at home because I'm not at work. So figuring out what those are for ourselves so that we can cope better.
Yeah, I think those are two really, really helpful call outs, Kirstie. This sense of, I think we talked about like committing to your decision. And I love your point where it's not about making the right decision, but making the decision right, because there is no right decision.
No, yeah.
Again, it's another one of these assumptions that we all have. Like, am I doing things right? And it's like, well, who the hell? I don't know. You don't know. Like, no one knows. So it is really about doing the homework with yourself and with your partner to figure out what's right for you, because no one can tell you that. We all have completely different lifestyles.
Yeah.
And talk to me about how do people set boundaries? This is something that I've always struggled with, and I know my wife struggles with, because we're kind of people pleasers, right?
Yeah.
And again, the first time you're doing it, when you are in a vulnerable state because you are returning as a mother and you've got these competing priorities, and you don't want to be seen as a bad worker or whatever, right? How do you? What are some simple things? I don't know if there are simple things, but what are there some particular things that you emphasize in terms of how to go about setting boundaries, and the right way to do that?
Yeah, I think it's thinking about. So I sometimes talk to people about kind of setting up a service level agreement with themselves.
Okay.
What are my, absolute hard lines, and what are the areas that I've got kind of some flexibility on? So there may be things like, depending on our role and what we're doing, but how much am I prepared to travel?
Yeah.
So if I'm in a job where I'm going to be away from home, deciding for myself, clearly in that kind of agreement with a partner, if I've kind of got one, and thinking about my baby, what is an okay level to travel for me and my family? And sort of deciding what that is, or the kind of rough boundaries of what that is. And therefore, when a piece of work gets offered to me and it means actually I'm going to have to travel, do I say yes to that or no to that? And if I already have that kind of boundary in place, that makes it a lot easier and alleviates the guilt at that period in time. Because do you know what? I said I'm only going to be away a maximum of 4 nights a month, and this is going to take me to 6. And actually, I might decide this is such an important piece of work, I'm going to do that. But it helps me feel guilty at that period in time. And also, I've had several pieces of work come in that are going to be overnight. Actually, if I can only do one, which one's going to be more important to me? Which one's going to be more fulfilling for me? Which one's going to help me achieve my career ambitions more, or give me more sense of satisfaction? So that will allow us to prioritize. So there might be levels of travel. There might be how much I decide to be online. So for example, if people work part-time and they have a day when they're not working, I often talk to people about what is your agreement with yourself of how much you're going to connect in with work.
Yes.
Is it absolutely nothing? No, I'm totally out of contact. Is it, I'm going to check in for an hour at lunchtime when my baby's asleep just to kind of keep on top of things? Kind of what is that? Because if we don't set that, then we could just end up kind of almost not being off work, but I'm trying to manage my baby as well. So it's really thinking, what time am I going to leave work that feels kind of okay for me? So it's just sort of setting those boundaries for myself, so that I'm not constantly having to make those decisions and then feel guilty because I think I should either be at work or be at home more.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that, again, it's establishing, as you're saying, that there's ground rules for yourself, so that you're not having to every time make the decision ad hoc or on the fly. And I guess the next step from there is then, once you've done the work to establish what are your boundaries that you want to defend or enforce, is then meeting your workplace wherever they are. So again, on the spectrum of workplace cultures, you're going to have those that maybe there's a very well-trodden route for mothers that are kind of returning, and they have a very supportive, compassionate workplace culture. That's often a big part of their proposition in terms of how they support people. you might be on the other end where you're maybe working in a startup or your own company, or just a company that isn't used to that. And how do you therefore meet them where they are? And that can be at a manager level or a workforce level. It might be established or completely not established because it's like, a startup. So I guess the point here is that you're advocating is, well, do the work so that you have that in the first place to then discuss. The next step is, how do you then realize that in your workplace, wherever they are, whether they're on site or maybe need to be kind of shifted up a gear. And then how do we start to then work so that you're meeting them and it's not just a one-sided conversation, right?
And I mean, there was a lovely example on a returning to work program that I was running. One of the mums that returned had said, one of the things I did is we used to always have an 8:00 stand-up meeting. And I said to the team, I can be there at 8:30, but I can't be there at 8:00 because I do nursery drop off and there's no way. So she said, there's a choice. Either we have it at 8:30 or you have it at 8 and then you update me when I come in. And it's just, actually, that's a non-shiftable boundary. Nurseries don't open any earlier, and therefore that I have no choice in this. But actually, there is a choice in terms of how we manage that. And what was great was when that lady shared the story, others in the group were like, oh, I didn't feel I could do that. And it's like,
yes,
well, but that's my boundary. That's one of my non-shiftable. I can't. And there was lots of lovely examples I saw of that in kind of organizations as well, that culturally, when people start to do that, that allows dads to do that as well and go, actually, I'm going to sports day this morning. I can't come in, because, and then that becomes a norm. And actually we find work levels can increase in terms of productivity and output because people are working in a way that feels better for them. So it's not we're slacking. It's actually, we're just working in a way that's more efficient and it's going to work well. Clearly.
and that's how you're opening up those conversations and being, it takes courage to share that and to be the first one to do it. But it's realizing that everyone will have these challenges to some degree. And it's making that, and there's having a level of flexibility on both sides. And that's where I think the relationship that you have, which is all individual, there's what you're doing and there's how you're doing it, right? So for the 8:30 example, having that clearly as your goal is great, but there can be probably ways that you can communicate that, as you said, that would make things easier to talk about and how you're doing that, as opposed to the same person, another person asking for the same thing might do it in a way that feels a bit too maybe abruptive. And a part of it is figuring out your style and your relationship with your manager or your workplace to make those things happen. But that's kind of where I guess the nuance of these conversations takes place. But I just think some really, really helpful practical advice, Kirstie, that you've given to kind of paint a picture that, people are in control. But I think oftentimes, probably the feeling is I'm completely at sea here. I have no idea how to even, I know I've got all these problems, but where do I even start? And that's where I think this kind of tidal wave of like, well, I can't even be bothered because I don't even know, I can't even solve the first thing. Where do I even start? But there is some very practical steps you can do to start feeling like, I'm in control here. I know there's a lot of things I can't control.
But this can.
But there's a lot I can control. And I think that sense of confidence that you talk about, the more you can feel like you're working your way through these things emotionally, cognitively, and then behaviorally, it's that upward cycle. And that becomes a very kind of hopefully empowering thing for mothers. So yeah. Great. Thank you, Kirstie. This has been a really helpful chat. I'd love to give you the opportunity to tell people to promote, one, the book, where they can find more information, any key resources, any kind of, where can they find more about you, Kirstie? So please tell.
So finding me, my LinkedIn's probably the easiest. I kind of don't post loads, but I do post stuff on there. So I try and kind of put articles on there, and there's quite a lot of previous articles that people might find helpful in terms of further resources. The book it's not in a lot of physical bookshops in the UK. It is in the States, but online everywhere. Amazon, Waterstones, Blackwell's, kind of all of the big bookshops have it online. So it's very easy to pick up.
And once again, the book is called Returning Well, A Guide for Working Parents and Their Managers. And anything else that we should? I mean,
I could chat about this all day, but no, I think that's probably it.
Oh, We can do further conversation. But Kirstie, thank you so much for your time. Again, for me, reading this stuff, what really jumped out to me was just it's very intuitive. As you're saying, I think part of the appeal is it's not rocket science, and that's not to downplay it at all, because I think it's very hard to take everything that there is and boil it down to something simple, right? Something that is intuitive, that is accessible. That's the hard work, actually. And I think so much of what you've got here is some really practical advice. So I think there's a lot, and as you're saying, it really helps to make all the knowledge that you've developed over the years accessible to everybody, right? So that's what I think is great about what you're doing. So fully recommend the read. And again, thank you, Kirstie, for your time. Really appreciate it.
Cool.
Okay.
Lovely to speak.
Thanks.